7 stars fell from the sky to burn a hole in the earth. Pelayo did not find gold. He found a 1,000-year-old secret that should have stayed buried. The dirt was screaming. The silver was bleeding light. 2,000 invaders are already 5 minutes away with steel and fire to erase this miracle from history. One man stands between a holy relic and a total massacre. This is not a legend. It is a war for the soul of the world. But the real horror is not the army at the gates. It is what is actually inside the silver casket. One night in 813, the silence of the Galician wilderness shattered. Pelayo, a hermit who had traded the company of men for the cold stone of a cave near Iria Flavia, felt the earth tremble. It was not the tremor of an earthquake, but a rhythmic vibration, as if the ground itself was breathing in sync with some ancient heart. He crawled from his shelter, his eyes stinging as a pillar of white fire descended from the 1,000 stars above. This was no ordinary meteor. The light did not fade. It anchored itself to a forgotten hill, overgrown with thickets of oak and bramble. Pelayo felt a magnetic pull, a force that demanded his presence. He grabbed his iron-tipped staff and ran, his breath coming in jagged gasps as he pushed through the dense undergrowth. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and incense, a combination that defied the logic of the damp Spanish forest. He reached the summit of the mound and stopped. The light was blinding, concentrated into 7 distinct beams that pointed directly into the roots of a massive 100-year-old oak tree. As he drew closer, a sound began to fill his ears. Not the wind, but a low, resonant chanting that vibrated in his chest. It was the music of a choir that didn't exist in this physical realm. Pelayo fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the dirt. Underneath the layer of rotted leaves and moss, he felt something hard and smooth. It was not the jagged granite of the mountains, but polished marble. He began to dig with a frantic, supernatural energy. His fingernails tore and blood stained the soil, but he felt no pain. The light grew more intense with every inch of earth he removed, illuminating the forest for 100 meters in every direction. 3 hours of relentless digging revealed a massive stone slab. It was inscribed with Latin characters that shimmered with a pale blue phosphorescence. Pelayo wiped away the grime to read the marks. But the language was ancient, dating back to the Roman occupation centuries ago. Just as he cleared the final corner of the lid, the ground groaned. The roots of the oak tree began to shift and snap like dry twigs. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the surrounding woods. Pelayo froze. It was not a wolf or a bear, but a scout, a lone rider clad in the dark leather of the Southern Caliphate. The enemy was closer than anyone in the village suspected. The scout's horse reared back, terrified by the supernatural glow. The soldier's eyes went wide as he saw the hermit standing over a glowing tomb. The scout drew a curved blade, the steel flashing in the celestial light. He didn't care about the miracle. He saw only a lone witness and a potential treasure. He spurred his horse forward, the hooves thundering against the exposed stone. Pelayo had no shield, only his wooden staff and a desperate faith. As the blade swung down in a lethal arc, a sudden burst of energy erupted from the tomb. The shock wave hit the rider like a physical wall, throwing him and his horse 5 meters backward into the brush. The air crackled with 1,000 sparks. Pelayo didn't wait to see if the man survived. He realized that this secret was too massive for one man to hold. This was not just a grave. It was a weapon of spirit, a beacon that could rally the fragmented Christian kingdoms against the 1,000s of invaders pressing from the south. He turned back to the slab one last time. The stone had cracked slightly from the energy discharge, revealing a glimpse of what lay within. It wasn't gold or jewels. It was a silver casket, untouched by decay, resting in a chamber that looked as though it had been prepared yesterday. Pelayo felt a surge of adrenaline that cleared the exhaustion from his 60-year-old limbs. He knew the paths through the mountains better than any soldier. He had to reach the Bishop of Iria Flavia before the scout regained consciousness or alerted his unit. The hermit turned and sprinted into the dark, leaving the glowing mound behind. Every shadow seemed to move. Every snap of a twig sounded like an army in pursuit. He covered 10 kilometers in record time, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he reached the outskirts of the settlement, he saw the torches of the night watch. Pelayo didn't slow down. He screamed for the gates to open, his voice raw and unrecognizable. The guards leveled their spears, wary of a madman emerging from the forest at 3 in the morning. But Pelayo didn't stop until he was at the heavy oak doors of the bishop's residence. He pounded on the wood with his bloodied fists, leaving crimson smears on the grain. He shouted that the stars had fallen, that the earth had opened, and that the protector of the land had been found. The doors creaked open to reveal a startled servant, but Pelayo pushed past him, heading straight for the inner sanctum where Bishop Teodomiro slept. The bishop met him in the hallway, wrapped in a heavy cloak, his face etched with irritation that quickly turned to shock. He saw the hermit's torn hands, the glowing dust that still clung to his robes, and the look of absolute certainty in his eyes. Pelayo didn't use flowery metaphors. He spoke of the 7 lights, the Roman tomb, and the silver casket hidden under the oak. He told the bishop that the Reconquista was no longer a desperate defense, but a holy mission. Teodomiro listened in silence, his hand trembling as he realized the implications. If this was truly the resting place of a high apostle, the power balance of the entire peninsula would shift in one night. But time was their enemy. Pelayo warned the bishop about the scout in the woods. If the caliphate's commanders realized what lay buried in the hills of Galicia, they would send 1,000s of men to raze the site to the ground. They couldn't wait for morning. Teodomiro turned to his captain of the guard and ordered 20 of his best men to arm themselves immediately. They needed to secure the site before the sun rose. As the soldiers buckled their armor and sharpened their swords, Pelayo stood in the courtyard, looking back toward the dark horizon. The light in the sky was fading, but the fire in his soul was just beginning to burn. The hunt for the holy remains had started, and the first blood had already been spilled. They rode out under the cover of the pre-dawn mist, the horses' hooves muffled by the damp grass. Pelayo led the way, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the hill. He could feel the connection to the site growing stronger the closer they got. But as they neared the oak tree, a smell hit them. Not incense this time, but wood smoke and burnt hair. Pelayo's heart sank. He saw the orange flicker of a campfire through the trees. The scout hadn't been alone. A small vanguard of the enemy had already reached the mound. They were standing around the exposed slab, their torches casting long, jagged shadows against the ancient stone. The bishop's captain signaled for silence. There were 12 enemy soldiers, well armed and curious. One of them was leaning over the crack in the stone, trying to pry it open with a crowbar. Pelayo felt a surge of righteous fury. This was desecration. He looked at the bishop, who gave a sharp, decisive nod. The 20 guards drew their steel, the sound of metal on metal echoing through the trees like a death knell. They didn't offer a surrender. With a roar that broke the silence of the Galician dawn, they charged. The battle for the tomb of Santiago had begun, and the stakes were nothing less than the soul of a nation. The steel of the Galician guards collided with the curved blades of the scouts in a spray of sparks and crimson. Pelayo watched from the tree line as the captain of the guard took down 2 enemies with a single sweep of his broadsword. The struggle was short, but brutal. The enemy vanguard, caught between the mystical glow of the tomb and the sudden fury of the Christian soldiers, broke formation. One soldier tried to flee toward the valley to alert the main caliphate army, but an arrow found its mark in his back, pinning him to a moss-covered rock. Within 10 minutes, the area around the oak was secured, but the air remained thick with the metallic tang of blood. Bishop Teodomiro stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the silver casket visible through the cracked stone slab. Teodomiro ordered his men to form a defensive circle 50 meters wide. He knew that the sound of combat would carry in the thin mountain air. He knelt by the pit Pelayo had dug, his hands trembling as he brushed away the remaining dirt. This was not a standard Roman burial. The symbols etched into the silver were early Christian icons: the fish, the anchor, and the scallop shell. The bishop used a sanctified dagger to pry open the heavy lid of the casket. As the hinges groaned, a scent like lilies and ancient cedar filled the clearing, instantly masking the smell of the dead soldiers nearby. Inside, lying on a bed of rotted silk that still held its purple hue, were the remains of 3 men. The bishop's breath hitched. He began to examine the parchment fragments tucked into the side of the casket. His eyes scanned the Latin script dating back to the 1st century. The central figure was draped in a traveler's cloak, and beside him lay a staff similar to the one Pelayo carried. The inscription spoke of a journey from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth, of a son of thunder who had come to the west to plant the seeds of faith. Teodomiro stood up, his face pale but radiant. He turned to his men and declared that they were standing before the remains of James the Great, the apostle of Jesus. The soldiers fell to their knees, the clatter of their armor echoing against the trees. The moment of religious awe was shattered by the sound of a distant horn. It was a low, guttural blast that signaled a much larger force approaching from the south. The scout Pelayo had encountered earlier had likely been part of a 100-man reconnaissance unit. Teodomiro realized they couldn't move the heavy stone sarcophagus quickly, and they certainly couldn't leave the remains to be captured. He ordered 5 of his fastest riders to gallop back to the King of Asturias, Alfonso II, to report the discovery. The remaining 15 men were told to prepare for a siege. They began to drag fallen logs and heavy stones to create a makeshift rampart around the oak tree. Pelayo, though not a soldier, became the heart of the labor. He used his knowledge of the terrain to point out the 2 narrow paths that led up the hill, suggesting they block the smaller one with boulders to force the enemy into a bottleneck. As they worked, the sun began to rise, casting long, bloody shadows across the forest floor. In the distance, they could see the glint of sun on 100 helmets. The enemy was moving fast, sensing that something of immense value was being guarded on this heights. The bishop stayed by the tomb, his lips moving in silent prayer, but his hand was gripped firmly around a heavy iron cross that could double as a mace. The first wave of the enemy reached the base of the hill at 8 in the morning. They were light cavalry, 40 riders strong, led by a commander in gilded mail. They paused, seeing the Christian banners already flying over the mound. The commander shouted a demand for the Roman treasures to be handed over, but Teodomiro climbed onto a rock and shouted back that this was holy ground, protected by the hand of God. The commander didn't hesitate. He raised his scimitar and ordered the charge. The horses struggled up the steep, slippery incline, their hooves churning the earth that Pelayo had so carefully excavated. The guards held their ground. As the first 5 riders reached the rampart, the Galicians thrust their spears through the gaps in the logs. 3 horses went down, throwing their riders into the dirt where they were quickly dispatched. But the weight of the numbers was telling. The enemy began to fire arrows, the shafts whistling through the leaves and thudding into the oak tree. One guard took an arrow to the shoulder and fell back, his blood splashing onto the edge of the silver casket. Pelayo grabbed the fallen man's spear, his old muscles screaming as he thrust the weapon at an attacker who was trying to climb over the logs. The fighting became a chaotic scramble of steel and bone. The 15 defenders were being pushed back toward the very edge of the pit. Teodomiro himself stepped into the fray, his iron cross cracking the helmet of an enemy soldier who had breached the perimeter. The bishop's presence turned the tide of the skirmish. The soldiers, seeing their priest fighting with the ferocity of a crusader, fought with renewed vigor. They managed to push the first wave back down the hill, leaving 12 enemy dead on the slopes. But the victory was hollow. Looking down from the summit, Pelayo saw the rest of the 100-man unit forming a line for a coordinated assault. They had 20 minutes before the next attack. Teodomiro knew they couldn't hold forever. He turned to Pelayo and told him that if the hill fell, he must take the sacred scrolls and the apostle's skull and run through the secret mountain paths he knew so well. The relics were more important than the men. Pelayo looked at the bishop, then at the silver casket, and finally at the approaching army. He realized that this was no longer a discovery. It was a spark that would burn across the entire peninsula. He refused to leave. He told the bishop that the apostle chose this place to be found, and the apostle would choose how it was defended. As the second wave of 60 soldiers began their slow, disciplined climb up the hill, a strange fog began to roll in from the Atlantic coast, despite the morning sun. It was thick, white, and moved with an unnatural speed. It swallowed the base of the hill, hiding the enemy from view. The sounds of the approaching army became muffled, distorted. Then, from within the mist, came the sound of 1,000 horses. The defenders froze, fearing a massive reinforcement for the enemy, but the sound was coming from the north. Pelayo looked up and saw a banner emerging from the fog, the Lion of Asturias. The king's vanguard had arrived sooner than anyone dared hope. The arrival of the Asturian vanguard turned the hillside into a slaughterhouse for the Caliphate's scouts. 50 heavy knights crashed through the mist, their lances impaling the enemy from the rear. The siege was broken in 15 minutes of red carnage. As the fog cleared, King Alfonso II himself rode up the slope, his armor caked in the dust of a forced march. He dismounted before the oak tree and knelt in the blood-soaked dirt before the open tomb. The king declared that a chapel of stone must be raised immediately to protect the apostle. Within 48 hours, the quiet woods of Iria Flavia were transformed into a chaotic construction site. Hundreds of stonemasons, carpenters, and monks arrived, followed closely by the first wave of 500 pilgrims who had heard rumors of the Starfield or Compostela. The transition from a hidden grave to a holy site was not peaceful. The scent of incense now competed with the smell of sweat and freshly sawn timber. Pelayo, once a man of total silence, found himself acting as a guide for the desperate. He saw mothers carrying sick children 100 kilometers on foot, and grizzled veterans seeking to wash the blood from their souls. But among the 1,000s of faithful, shadows moved. The Caliphate had not forgotten the loss. They viewed this discovery as a dangerous psychological weapon that could unify the fractured Christian north. Small bands of assassins began to infiltrate the pilgrim trails. 3 monks were found dead in their tents just 200 meters from the tomb, their throats cut with surgical precision. The tension escalated when a high-ranking defector from the south arrived at the site, claiming he had seen a 2,000-man army gathering to level the chapel before its consecration. Bishop Teodomiro ordered the construction of a wooden palisade to surround the emerging stone walls. The pilgrims were no longer just worshippers. They were a volunteer militia. Pelayo watched as 70-year-old men sharpened stakes and young women prepared cauldrons of boiling oil. The site was no longer a place of prayer. It was a fortress of faith. Every 2 hours, a new alarm was raised as silhouettes were spotted in the tree line. The psychological pressure was 10 times worse than the physical battle. The first miracle occurred during a night raid by 30 elite enemy saboteurs. They managed to set fire to the wooden scaffolding surrounding the new chapel. As the flames jumped 10 meters into the air, threatening to collapse the roof onto the silver casket, a sudden, localized torrential rain fell only on the hill. The fire was extinguished in 60 seconds, leaving the surrounding forest bone dry. The pilgrims erupted in a frenzy of religious zeal. But Pelayo remained wary. He found a dropped scimitar near the tomb with a seal he recognized, the black guard of the emir. This wasn't a random raid. It was a calculated attempt to erase the miracle from history. By the end of the first month, the chapel stood 5 meters high, a squat, sturdy structure of granite. The number of pilgrims grew to 2,000. Creating a sprawling camp that lacked sanitation and food. Disease began to spread, killing 5 people every day. The bishop struggled to maintain order as supplies ran low. Rumors began to circulate among the starving crowd that the bishop was hiding grain inside the tomb chamber. A riot nearly broke out at the gates of the palisade. Pelayo stood between the angry mob and the entrance, his staff held high. He didn't speak. He simply pointed to the glowing light that still emanated from the cracks in the stone. The crowd fell silent. the hunger in their bellies replaced by the awe in their hearts. The peace was shattered by a thunderous explosion from the south path. The enemy had brought up 2 primitive catapults hidden under the canopy of the forest. The first projectile, a 50-kilogram stone wrapped in burning pitch, smashed through the palisade, killing 4 guards instantly. The camp turned into a panicked hive. The 500 soldiers stationed there scrambled for their shields, but the projectiles kept coming every 5 minutes. The chapel, the very heart of the Reconquista, was being systematically dismantled by long-range fire. The bishop looked to the king's captain, but the captain knew they couldn't charge into the dark forest against an unseen number of archers. Pelayo realized that the secret paths he used as a hermit were the only way to save the site. He knew a trail that led behind the catapult positions, a path so narrow and steep that no horse could traverse it. He gathered 12 of the most agile pilgrims, men who had been hunters and mountain goats in their former lives. They armed themselves with nothing but long knives and 10 jars of Greek fire. They slipped out of a postern gate under the cover of the smoke from the burning tents. The climb was 300 meters of vertical rock, their fingers bleeding as they gripped the jagged slate. They reached the plateau behind the enemy lines just as the 10th projectile was being loaded. Pelayo saw the 200 soldiers guarding the catapults. They were relaxed, confident in their superior range. He gave the signal. The 12 men descended like ghosts. They smashed the jars of Greek fire onto the wooden frames of the catapults. The explosion was massive, a 20-meter ball of blue and orange flame that lit up the entire valley. The enemy panicked, thinking a whole army had flanked them. In the confusion, Pelayo's group vanished back into the shadows, leaving the siege engines in ruins. They returned to the hill as heroes, but the victory was short-lived. From the heights of the oak tree, Pelayo looked south and saw 1,000s of torches snaking through the valley like a glowing serpent. The 2,000-man army was no longer a rumor. It was a reality. The emir's main force was 6 hours away. The bishop called for a final prayer, knowing that by dawn, the chapel would either be a monument of victory or a mass grave. The scale of the coming conflict was 100 times larger than anything Pelayo had ever imagined. The shadow of the 2,000-man army loomed over the valley, but a different poison was spreading within the walls of the hill fortress. As the sun began to rise on the day of the expected siege, a group of 5 high-ranking Asturian nobles, led by Count Rodrigo, confronted Bishop Teodomiro. They claimed the discovery was a strategic lie fabricated to send men to their deaths for a patch of Galician dirt. Rodrigo demanded to see the remains of the apostle with his own eyes, threatening to withdraw his 300 seasoned knights if his intellectual doubts were not satisfied. This internal rebellion was 100 times more dangerous than the external threat. The camp, already exhausted by 30 days of tension and 5 days of hunger, began to fracture. Teodomiro stood his ground, refusing to open the silver casket for the sake of political pride. He argued that the light Pelayo saw was proof enough, but the nobles, influenced by the cold logic of military survival, were not moved by mysticism. The argument reached a breaking point when Rodrigo drew his sword inside the chapel, a move that carried a 1,000-year curse of excommunication. Pelayo stepped between the blade and the bishop, his presence a silent reminder of the humble origins of this miracle. Just as the steel was about to clash, a horn sounded from the southern ridge. The enemy was no longer a distant threat. Their 500 vanguard archers were already taking positions on the opposite slope. The first volley of 1,000 arrows whistled through the air, raining down on the crowded camp. 12 pilgrims were pinned to the earth before the first scream even died out. The internal conflict was instantly replaced by the raw instinct for survival. Count Rodrigo, seeing the scale of the enemy formation, realized that retreat was impossible. They were 100% surrounded. He turned his aggression toward the enemy, ordering his knights to man the northern gate. The bishop, meanwhile, took the silver casket and placed it on a high stone altar in the center of the construction site, making it the visible heart of the defense. The siege began in earnest at 10 in the morning. The enemy commanders, knowing the psychological value of the site, did not use a standard approach. They sent 3 waves of 200 infantrymen equipped with long ladders and heavy iron hooks. The wooden palisade, weakened by the previous night's fires, groaned under the weight. Pelayo moved among the defenders, his hands occupied with carrying jars of 180 boiling oil to the ramparts. He saw 19-year-old boys trembling as they held their spears, their eyes fixed on the sea of dark turbans and shimmering scimitars below. The scale of the assault was 5 times greater than the previous skirmish. A second wave of projectiles, this time launched from mobile ballistae, smashed into the stone walls of the unfinished chapel. One massive bolt, 2 meters long, pierced the heavy oak door, narrowly missing the bishop. The defenders were losing ground. The southern gate was breached by a heavy ram, and 50 enemy shock troops poured into the lower courtyard. Count Rodrigo led a countercharge, his knights' heavy horses trampling the intruders in the narrow space. But for every 1 enemy killed, 3 more seemed to climb over the walls. The air was a thick soup of dust, blood, and the metallic tang of clashing steel. In the midst of the carnage, a point of reconnection occurred. A group of 50 pilgrims, led by a blind monk, began to sing the same ancient chant Pelayo had heard on the first night. The sound was eerie, cutting through the screams of the dying and the roar of the fire. The soldiers, hearing the melody, felt a strange coldness wash over their fear. It wasn't a physical strength, but a mental clarity. Pelayo felt his own exhaustion vanish. He climbed to the highest point of the scaffolding, a 15-meter drop below him, and began to hurl stones at the enemy commanders. One stone struck a captain, causing a 5-minute delay in the enemy's coordination. By 3 in the afternoon, the fortress was a 100% ruin, yet the chapel remained standing. The enemy had lost 400 men, but the defenders were down to their last 100 able-bodied soldiers. The bishop, his robes splattered with the blood of the wounded he had been tending, realized that the final assault was coming. The enemy was bringing up their reserve, the 800 elite guard of the emir. These were men who had never known defeat. Rodrigo, humbled by the bravery of the peasant pilgrims, knelt before the silver casket and asked for a final blessing. The divide between noble and commoner had been burned away by the fires of the siege. Just as the elite guard began their slow, rhythmic march up the hill, the sky turned a bruised, unnatural purple. Pelayo felt the same vibration in the earth he had felt 4 weeks ago. He looked at the silver casket. It wasn't just reflecting the sun. It was pulsing with an internal light that grew 10 times brighter every second. The enemy halted, their horses refusing to move another step toward the summit. A sense of dread hit the caliphate's ranks. They had fought men and walls, but they were not prepared to fight the earth itself. The 800 elite guards hesitated for 60 seconds, a fatal window in warfare. The bishop seized the moment, raising his mace and shouting a single word that would become the battle cry of the next 700 years. Santiago! The 100 survivors, fueled by a 1,000% surge of adrenaline, threw themselves over the ruins of the palisade. They weren't a disorganized mob. They were a single, pointed spear of iron. Pelayo, leading the charge with his staff, felt as though the wind itself was pushing him forward at 20 kilometers per hour. The 2 forces collided at the base of the mound. The impact was so violent that the sound could be heard in Iria Flavia, 10 kilometers away. The elite guard, though superior in numbers and equipment, were paralyzed by the sight of the glowing chapel behind the Christian line. They began to fall back, their formation breaking into 100 isolated pockets of panic. But the victory was not yet won. From the rear of the enemy lines, the emir's personal herald signaled for the final 500 riders to charge. This was the moment of absolute scale, the weight of an empire against the faith of a hermit. The ground did not just tremble, it roared. As the emir's 500 elite heavy riders began their final descent, the 100 survivors of the hill stood in a thin, desperate line. The momentum of the 2,000-kilogram horse and rider units was calculated to crush the Christian defense in exactly 60 seconds. Pelayo stood at the center, his iron-tipped staff planted in the blood-soaked mud. He could see the 1,000s of sparks flying from the horses' hooves as they struck the rocky path. The scale of the threat was absolute. Count Rodrigo gripped his shattered shield, whispering a final prayer, while Bishop Teodomiro stood on the chapel's general's unfinished rampart, holding the silver casket high for all to see. The collision was a 100% explosion of sound and violence. The first 10 knights of the Asturian Guard were vaporized by the sheer mass of the charging cavalry. But then, the second miracle of the Starfield manifested. As the primary wave of riders hit the Christian line, the light from the silver casket intensified into a 100-meter flash of pure white energy. The horses of the Emir's Guard, 100% blind for a crucial 5 seconds, reared back in a panicked frenzy. They began to trample their own infantry, turning the narrow valley into a 10-meter-deep pit of chaos. The Christian defenders, seemingly protected by an invisible wall of wind, moved forward with a speed that defied their 40 hours of exhaustion. Pelayo found himself in the heart of the 500-man melee. He didn't fight like a soldier. He moved like a force of nature. Every time his staff struck an enemy's armor, a 100-volt spark of light erupted, throwing the attacker back 3 meters. The 100 survivors were now fighting with the strength of 1,000. Count Rodrigo carved a path through the elite guard, his sword moving at a 180 degrees arc of destruction. He reached the Emir's herald and struck him down, seizing the black silk banner of the caliphate. The sight of their fallen standard caused a 90% collapse in the enemy's morale. The 2,000-man army, once a disciplined machine of conquest, was now a fractured mass of 1,000s of terrified individuals. The battle shifted from the hill to the plains of Iria Flavia. The 100 defenders were suddenly joined by 300 armed peasants from the surrounding villages, who had seen the celestial light and interpreted it as a call to arms. They fell upon the retreating enemy with pitchforks and scythes. The scale of the slaughter was unprecedented for the region. 1,500 enemy soldiers lay dead or dying in the tall grass. The Emir's commanders tried to organize a third stand near the river, but a sudden flash flood, despite the 0% chance of rain in the forecast, swept away their bridge, trapping 400 riders on the Christian side of the bank. In the 60th minute of the final charge, Pelayo saw the leader of the assault, a high-ranking general in 24-karat gold-inlaid armor. The general raised his bow, aiming a poisoned arrow directly at Bishop Teodomiro. Pelayo didn't think. He lunged. The arrow pierced Pelayo's side, but the hermit didn't fall. He pulled the 20-centimeter shaft from his flesh and kept moving, his blood glowing with the same pale blue light as the tomb. He reached the general and struck the ground with his staff. The earth split in a 2-meter-wide chasm, swallowing the general's horse and sending the leader tumbling into the depths. The remaining 500 enemy soldiers fled toward the south, leaving behind 100% of their supplies, 50 horses, and the 2 catapults they had used to desecrate the site. The silence that followed was 10 times louder than the battle. The hill was covered in the 1,000s of arrows and the broken steel of 2 nations. The bishop descended from the rampart, his eyes fixed on Pelayo, who was leaning against the oak tree, his wound closing before their very eyes. The 100 survivors fell to their knees, not in exhaustion, but in realization. They had not just won a battle, they had witnessed the birth of a legend that would sustain the Reconquista for 700 years. As the sun reached its 12th peak, the 300 peasants and 100 soldiers began the grim task of clearing the field. They found that the silver casket was completely unscratched, despite 100s of projectiles hitting the chapel. The bishop announced that from this day forward, the site would be known as Santiago de Compostela, the Field of Stars. The news of the 2,000-man defeat reached the king in 24 hours, and the first royal decree was issued. Every Christian in the peninsula must make the pilgrimage to this spot at least once in their life. The first major victory of the spirit had been won. Pelayo, his body 100% healed, but his soul forever changed, looked at the horizon. He knew the war was far from over. The emir would return with 10,000 men next time, but the 100 defenders had proved that faith was a weapon more effective than 1,000 scimitars. The first chapter of the crusade had been written in blood and light. The hermit turned his back on the battlefield and walked toward the silver casket, ready to serve as its first eternal guardian. The transition from a simple grave to a world-shaping shrine was 100% complete. The smoke of the 2,000-man battle cleared, leaving a silence that stretched across the Galician mountains. Within 7 days of the victory, King Alfonso II arrived at the site with a retinue of 500 architects, stone carvers, and high priests. He did not come as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim, walking the final 5 kilometers on foot without his crown. The king declared that the modest stone chapel was no longer enough. A cathedral of 100 meters in length would be raised over the silver casket. This was the moment the Reconquista transformed from a series of border skirmishes into a 700-year crusade. The Field of Stars became the first spiritual capital of the resistance, a 100% vital beacon for the fragmented Christian kingdoms of the north. Pelayo, the man who had started it all with a single night of digging, refused the golden titles offered by the crown. He accepted only one duty: to be the first guardian of the shell. He took the scallop shells from the nearby coast, the first 100 symbols of the pilgrimage, and gave them to the survivors of the siege. These shells became the first official passports for travelers, a sign that they were under the protection of the apostle. The hermit's cave was replaced by a small cell built into the cathedral's foundation, where he watched as 1,000s of tons of granite were hauled up the hill. The physical transformation of the landscape was 100% complete. The wild forest of Iria Flavia was now a city of God. By the year 830, the first great basilica was consecrated. The news had crossed the Pyrenees, reaching the courts of Europe. The first international pilgrims began to arrive from 1,000s of kilometers away, bringing with them 100s of different languages and customs. This was the point of reconnection for a continent that had been fractured since the fall of Rome. The 100 soldiers who had defended the hill now served as the First Order of Santiago, a military elite dedicated to protecting the 500-kilometer-long trail from the south. The scale of the movement was massive. Every 1 kilometer of the road was marked by a new hospital, a hostel, or a fortress. But the spiritual victory had a sharp edge. 20 years after the discovery, a new caliphate army of 5,000 men moved north, intent on erasing the Santiago cult once and for all. They reached the gates of the new city, but they did not find a terrified population. They found a fortress city defended by 1,000s of pilgrims who were 100% willing to die for the ground they stood on. In the heat of the second siege, a legend was born. A white knight on a 100% pure stallion appeared on the ramparts, his sword flashing with the same 7 lights Pelayo had seen. The enemy fled in 10 minutes, convinced that the apostle himself was leading the charge. This legend of Santiago Matamoros became the first psychological wall that the invaders could never climb. Pelayo's life was nearing its end as the cathedral's second level was completed. He had lived to see the first 10,000 pilgrims pass through the gates. On his final night, at the age of 85, he asked to be carried to the silver casket. The light was no longer a blinding explosion, but a soft, 100% steady glow that filled the crypt. He touched the stone one last time, and the 1,000s of scars on his hands, from the digging, the fire, and the arrows, finally vanished. He died in the 60th minute of the midnight hour. Passing away at the exact moment, a new star appeared in the constellation above the altar. He left no riches, only a first-hand account of the miracle that would be copied into 1,000s of manuscripts. The finale of the story reaches its 100% culmination in the 12th century, when the final stones of the great Romanesque cathedral were set. The site was now the 3rd most important holy place in the world, alongside Jerusalem and Rome. The 1,000s of pilgrims who walked the Camino created a 100% unique cultural bridge, moving ideas and art across borders as easily as they moved their feet. The hermit's discovery had not just saved a kingdom, it had defined the identity of an entire nation. The Reconquista would continue for 100s of years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The spirit of the 100 defenders lived on in every stone of the city. The story ends with a sharp, effectful vision. A modern traveler, 1,200 years later, reaching the same hill and seeing the twin towers of the cathedral piercing the clouds. The light of the first night still burns in the 1,000s of candles inside. The transition from a lonely hermit's dream to a global legacy is 100% absolute. The silver casket remains, a silent witness to the 1,000s of battles fought in its name. The final word belongs to the wind that still blows through the Galician oaks, whispering the name Santiago to anyone who has the courage to dig for the truth.